So I am Cinnamon Dornseif. I'm the Foreign Policy Institute's director, and it is my honor and pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon for this event. In the fall of 2022, there was a lecture on the possibilities of North American integration, the objective of which was to reflect on a much broader perspective on the bigger dynamics and forces that bind the region together and on the nature of the obstacles and also often dilemmas that prevent more integration from happening. The purpose of this second lecture is to continue this conversation, focusing on a series of concrete issues, assuming the longer-term prosperity and security relative to each country's own circumstances can only be ensured by harnessing our geography, partnership, and unavoidable interdependence. Thus, health and health threats, guaranteeing access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy, and secure and efficient supply chains as a joint strategic objective of Canada, Mexico, and the United States have emerged as the most compelling. And today we're going to be exploring what is being done and what is needed. I will give a very brief background of our distinguished speaker's career. Ambassador Juan Jose Gomez Camacho is a senior fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, as well as a member of our teaching faculty here at SAIS. Prior to joining SAIS, he served as the ambassador of Mexico to Canada. Before that, he served as ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York from 2016 to 2019, ambassador to the European Union, as well as to the Kingdom of Belgium and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg from 2013 to 2016. Ambassador and permanent representative to the international organizations based in Geneva, Switzerland from 2009 to 2013. And prior to that, ambassador to the Republic of Singapore and concurrently the Union of Myanmar and the Sultanate of Brunei Darussalam. And that was from 2006 to 2009. Let me just pause here to say that he is one of the most influential, experienced Mexican diplomats and highly recognized within multilateral diplomacy. During his 34-year career, I just gave you some of the highlights, he played a key role in addressing diverse and increasingly complex global challenges, both political and economic. Some of his major achievements include the conclusion of breakthrough international agreements on emerging global health challenges, the adoption of the first ever global deal on international migration, and the successful negotiation of the framework of the new trade agreement between Mexico and the European Union.
Thank you, Cinnamon. Well, first, thanks so much always to you for your extraordinary support since I joined SAIS, and thank you to you all for coming. I should say, or I should start also by saying that I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scholar, and I approach this with you today as a reflection more than anything else, almost like thinking out loud with you. And I do this with a mix of the feelings of a citizen, not only of a Mexican citizen, but I truly believe, see myself also as a North American citizen. I approach this with some experience, if you like, as a practitioner. And I also do it from the incredible privilege, if I can put it this way, that this house SAIS has given me, not only for being here, but the opportunity to put some distance between, again, the emotions of the citizen and the experience of the practitioner, and to see from some distance what's going on in North America. And as Cinnamon said in her introduction, very kind introduction, the idea is to see the broader forces that move, operate, happened within North America and where these forces will take us. The first thing I would say, again, putting distance between me and North America, if I can put it this way, me and my past, that's better said, is that I started by doubting or wondering, asking myself, what do we mean by integration? It's a term that is commonly used, it's a commonplace. It became like slogan, integration, integration, integration. But what do we mean by integration? And I see it based or keeping in mind 2 or 3 very hard facts that make North America an entirely different animal than any other in the world. The first one is the asymmetry. And this was what we were discussing during the last lecture. The asymmetry. The asymmetry between the US and then Canada and Mexico is brutal. The US remains and clearly will remain the biggest superpower we have seen. And if you compare the US to Mexico and Canada, the distance is just gigantic. So the first question is, can a superpower, can a mammoth like the US integrate with the 2 small neighbors? And I will not try to answer that question. I just leave it there. It's huge. And by the way, because of this enormous distance, the size of the US and the role that the US plays globally as the superpower, unlike many other cases of real, more horizontal integration, when the US decides to move, it moves, regardless of Mexico and Canada. If you think, and we may discuss this later during the conversation, but if you think of just the Inflation Reduction Act, if you think of the CHIPS Act, you see, it's just mind-boggling. I'm sorry that I say this in an absolutely non-academic way. It's mind-boggling to see the size, the sheer size capacity of the US to move. So when the mammoth decides to move, it moves. So back to the question, integration Mexico-Canada. Second premise, again, from my new distance from my own past. And I say this because I have been a believer in the integration, and I've been working for that integration, quote unquote. The second is Mexico and Canada themselves, or ourselves. We have always also said, believed, a bit rhetorically, but with a high degree of conviction, that Mexico and Canada are also neighbors, that we live in the same neighborhood, that we are integrating again with the US, the 3 of us, etc., etc. And the reality is that if you think Mexico and Canada have almost nothing in common other than the US. And that's a big thing to say. Are we neighbors? As we always think we are we neighbors? We hardly are neighbors. Just if you think geographically, Cinnamon, just geographically, the distance between the southern border of the US and its northern border, forget about going further south or further north, is thousands of kilometers. But it's not only about geography and physical distance. It's also about culture, idiosyncrasy, wealth, perceptions of ourselves as countries. The distance is enormous. So if you think Mexico, Canada, neighbors, close allies, partners, and so on and so forth, hardly. we, this what I am saying is, by the way, is not a negative reflection of all this. Is trying to bring you to where I think the integration is it's happening. But to understand it, you need to see this context. So Canada and Mexico are getting close for virtue of NAFTA itself, and also as a matter of a choice. We could remain separate, distant, unknown to each other as we are. We are very much unknown to each other. But we have made the choice to be close and increasingly, to try to be close, and increasingly we are getting there. But it's not because we are naturally close. It's not because we are natural partners. It's not because we are neighbors. It's not because we live together, because we don't. And again, and I close this part with this. The relationship between Mexico and Canada, the interest between Mexico and Canada, the role Mexico plays to Canada, the role Canada plays to Mexico, it's almost always 90% linked to each other's interest and perception of the US. And that's how we need to understand each other. Is that bad? I said this recently because this is new reflection to me, and the people I was sharing this new thought were absolutely scandalized. I was well, sinful. Because how come? We are neighbors. We like each other. No, we are not neighbors. And yeah, we should like each other even more. And we are in the process of liking each other even more. Uh-huh. But the point is that all of this doesn't mean that there isn't a very strategic argument for the three of us, but particularly to Mexico and Canada, to be together. So let's say this is the context of what we discussed last time, a little bit more evolved after a few months of thinking.
Right. Well, thank you. For those of you that have just joined us, that was a recap of the fall lecture that really explored the broad themes of North American integration and indeed some of the critical thinking that underlies that. I also mentioned in the introduction that the themes that you've chosen to focus on today include health and health threats resilience, yep, the guaranteeing access to clean and affordable and reliable energy, secure and efficient supply chains. I mean, all of these are intuitively obvious to anyone as being just global goods. But if you could get a little bit more into detail about your process of selecting those and focusing on them, that would be very helpful.
Okay, so despite these premises I just described, that again sound negative, but they are not, the three countries, relative to each country's own size, capacities, circumstances, etc., are very independent. For Mexico or Canada, the US is absolutely indispensable in any possible way, in terms of security and in terms of prosperity, present and future, for both. And certainly for Mexico, even more, because Mexico is, let's say, the weaker link in the trio. Weaker in terms of development, weaker in terms of things that you can imagine. But also for the US itself, Mexico and Canada, yes, the US can do without us in many things, but still we are next door. We are very interconnected. You can judge yourselves whether this is huge or not huge, but we are increasingly interconnected. And whatever it happens in Mexico and Canada has an impact, a meaningful impact in the US. And that we have to understand. So, why health first? I see health not only as health, and Cinnamon and I have discussed this many times. Health is not only health. Health is security. Health is prosperity. Health is development. Health is political stability. Health is jobs, employment, and economic growth. Threats to health mean exactly the opposite. Potential insecurity, political instability, loss of economic growth, sacrifice of prosperity in the future. And that, all these things are existential for the three countries, are critical. Let's change the term, are critical for the three countries. So I see health and human beings, for the purpose of this reflection, as human capital. All of us, our children, the children of our children, if they are there, the people in the three countries, these North American societies, again, each with its own circumstances that are increasingly interconnected, mixing, etc., are the capital that allows the three countries to keep moving on and to maintain a promising future. Is central for the three countries. So what's happened? What's going on in terms of health? Let me mention 4 quick things. One that I was not planning to mention, but I have to mention it because it's complex, tragic, and increasingly affecting the social fabric of the three countries, which is drugs, the fentanyl crisis. And that's not only health, but it's a threat to this human capital that is so essential for the future. Let alone human rights, morals, and ethics that, of course, are underlying everything that we should do. But let's think pragmatically, crudely, in terms of human capital. That's one point. The other is the pandemic. And if you think of the pandemic, it's not that, okay, it happened already, it was dramatic. There will be more pandemics. And this last pandemic cost US over 100 million infections or infected people, over 1 million dead. Terrible. Mexico reported 6 million infected. I think it's an under-reporting. I think Mexico at least should have had 30, 40 million infections easily. Canada, a bit more credible, around 5 million. Canada, 150,000 dead, 53 or 54,000 dead people. In the case of Mexico, 700. But the problem is not only that. The problem is the economic effects of this. In the US, there are different analyses. But if you put together everything, meaning loss of GDP, 8% in the three countries, just think of the size of the US economy, the loss of productivity, the loss of jobs, the people that had to exit the job market or the labor market because of the disease, and so on and so forth. Some calculate that it could be in the region of 15 trillion US dollars. Same logic. The cost in Canada, around 170 billion US dollars. Mexico, 190 billion US dollars. So without diminishing the cost of the loss of life, which in itself is brutal, that should never happen. But think in terms again of the future, prosperity, the capacity to keep building the countries we have, the countries and the societies we want. Non-communicable diseases. You rarely hear this discussion, and I'm always in that. I believe is critical. Just one global figure, so put some context. In the world, around the world, every year, the figure changes and it increases a bit every year, but let's use the last one, die more or less 63, 64 million people. Out of the 8 billion of population in the world, 60 million or so die. The previous year, 58, 59, 61, and next year it'll be a bit more. 70% of those deaths are the result of one or more so-called non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases, cancer, diabetes, respiratory diseases, and so on and so forth. So 45 million people are dying of these diseases, and most of them should have not died. And this is very important. More or less 25% of them are premature deaths. Young people. Keep thinking in terms of human capital. And the estimated cost globally of this loss could reach, if we don't change the trend, 30, 40 trillion US dollars every 3 years. It's just mind-boggling. So let's come back to North America. In the US, more or less 3.5 million people die every year. In Mexico, 1.4, 1.5 every year. In Canada, 600, 700,000 every year. Of them, in the case of the US, 1.2, 1.3 million are the result of non-communicable diseases. In the case of Mexico, around 700,000. And in the case of Canada, around 300,000. The cost, again, think of the brutal human capital loss and the brutal economic loss for the three countries. Is a threat. And if we as North America, on this we can say Canada, US, or Mexico, but as we have seen, diseases do not recognize borders. And for different reasons and explanations, we could spend hours debating here. The trends are the same, and the solutions should be connected between the three countries and indeed globally. But we are thinking of North America. But again, the challenge and the threats are just brutal, existential, and I'm not exaggerating. In 10 years, 20 years, if we do not change this trend, there will be no public money to handle this. Because, by the way, the case of the end disease or the chronic diseases is not that people die, which is terrible. It's also that people survive, which means that we have a phenomenon where people are getting ill younger and living many years. So now we have millions that suffer these diseases that have to leave or to exit the labor market, but will still live 15 or 20 years at a cost that is brutal, without or having lost also at the same time 100% of their productivity. So you have enormous groups of society that have to stop contributing to production, to generation of wealth, and they become net costs to the other part of society that is producing. This sounds terrible what I am saying, and I'm not trying to see human beings as machines. But this is true. And if you think in terms of policies, in terms of policy making, in terms of security and the future, you need to think about these things. Number 3, antimicrobial resistance. Or 4, antimicrobial resistance. We've discussed this in my class with my students, by the way. Antimicrobial resistance, as you know, basically is that pathogens, the microbials, viruses, bacteria, fungi, etc., are becoming resistant to antimicrobials, meaning to antivirals, antibiotics, and so on and so forth. Which means that infections that used to be almost routine infections or the cure was routine. You got an infection, just go to the doctor, 4 days, 5 days of an antibiotic, and you are done. Well, now they are becoming, or have become, or are increasingly fast becoming life-threatening. People are starting to die out of these infections because the pathogens are becoming resistant to the antimicrobials, and there are no new antimicrobials to kill them. So if we don't change this trend globally, in 10 years, this will be the first cause of death in the world. And to show the drama of this, before I come down to North America, 100 years ago, the first cause of death, the great battle of humanity in terms of health, were precisely the infections. Until penicillin and antibiotics were discovered, and then the infections and the ratio, the death rate of infections went down, decade after decade. That's how we became healthier. And then, because of that, the threat to human health became the non-communicable diseases, non-infectious diseases, and the ones we are experiencing now as a huge threat. But now, simultaneously, because of the resistance, we are going back to where we were 100 years ago, and the infections that were killing humanity 100 years ago are killing humanity again now. So the threat is just brutal. In the case of the US, there are already some, I think, around 40, 50,000 deaths every year, which sounds very little because of resistance. In the case of Canada, like 40,000. And in the case of Mexico, there's no data, but should be something like that. I think the three are higher. But again, the problem is not only those that have been killed. Also, the problem is those that are, in the US, for example, there are almost 3 million of infections every year, regular infections. The problem is, again, that on the one hand, people are dying. People that are not dying but are infected are totally enter the realm of disability, very often permanently, and the economic loss is just brutal. So North America, the three countries, need to approach this as a strategic challenge, objective, common objective, and to do something. And there are things we are doing. Some are happening, some are not. Some are planned, more successful than others, but is ongoing. So we will discuss that if you want with more detail. Energy, there is no way the economic machinery of North America can happen, can roll, can exist, can be successful without energy. And at the same time, we are experiencing another threat to our very existence, which is the environment and climate change. Where are we? What are we doing? Are we doing enough? Are we not doing enough? Just to say it roughly, and then again we can go to a little bit more detail. If you compare 1990 to where we are now in 2020, let's say 3 decades per country, the energy mix of the region was more or less an average of 73-74% fossil fuel energy and 20-something% renewable energy. Fossil fuel, as you can imagine, coal, oil, and gas. Renewables, as you can also imagine, mostly hydroelectric, wind, solar, and in the case of nuclear, Mexico little, the US, Canada, a bit more. 3 decades after, the mix and the proportions have not changed too much, I have to say. The US went down from, I think, from 80% of fossil fuel to 72%, 71%, important. Mexico moved from 76 to 71, and Canada stayed the same from 70, I think at 70, 71, 1%. Now, this is easy to criticize and to say. I think it's more complex than just sharing these numbers. The three countries have to have, I think they accept, the three of them, and I will say the case of Mexico, which we are a little bit the outlier now, or not a little bit, a lot. I think if we want to have a sense of future, prosperity, and survival, because this is really true, together with health, these are really existential threats. The three countries need to have the ability to ensure access to clean, reliable, and affordable energy. This is what will allow us to keep our livelihoods, save the planet, remain as societies as we are, and at the same time growing, creating the prosperity and wealth that is essential for obvious reasons that do not need to explain. So back to the figures, there are very interesting trends. One is that despite that the percentages didn't change too much, and by the way, here is Francisco Gonzalez that has been educating me on this, so he can correct me on this. Is that, well, first, renewables, there is huge investment. There is a very encouraging process in the three countries that we are increasingly relying more and more on gas, natural gas. Many people criticize a lot the idea of gas because gas is still a non-renewable, it pollutes. But gas is the best of the alternatives to make sure that we can push the transition without risking the energy security. You cannot turn one switch off before the other one is on. And this is critical. This is one of the most complex things that the three governments have to do. So the investment in gas, of course, after the shale explosion in the US, oil and gas, the region became extremely robust in terms of energy. North America is energy rich, both non-renewables and renewables. Two elements here, and I will close this chapter. That takes me back to what I said before. When the mammoth decides to move, it moves, whether the neighbors like it or not, whether across the Atlantic like it or not. This is what it is. So here we have the Inflation Reduction Act, very controversial. Is not designed to favor North America. It's not designed with a North American approach. Mm-hmm. No, back to the elephant moves and that's it. Now, that said, and as you know, it's highly criticized, particularly in Europe, because, it's basically industrial policy. It's based on subsidies and is designed to attract investment to the US. But that said, you can have your own views, whether this is good, whether this is bad, or whatever. But that said, I think this investment IRA will have potentially one of the most consequential positive impacts on climate change and clean energy development globally, simply because of the sheer size, the massive size of the US and the amount of money being approved for those purposes. At least in some chapters of that, the US heard the arguments both of Mexico and Canada and accepted to, let's say, expand, I will call them the policies, not to keep repeating subsidies, they are subsidies, to manufacturing, to include Mexico and Canada in the value chain. This means that Mexico and Canada, if we also create the incentives on our own sides, we can connect our own energy transformation processes to this massive American effort and really create or speed up or accelerate the process in the region of developing cleaner energy. The other outlier, as I was saying, is Mexico. Even if Mexico had for many years very strong climate change awareness, clean energy efforts and policies, very aggressively with huge ambitions on carbon reduction, CO2 reductions, emissions reductions, and we put in place very highly sophisticated regulations and policies to do that. The last 4 years, as you all know, there have been very important changes in that chapter. Mexico has, let's say, slowed down in a very controversial way the energy efforts, but nevertheless, rhetoric aside, noise aside, dust in the air aside, because politics are like this, on the ground, the efforts are very, very important nevertheless. In foreign investment, Canadian investment is coming very heavily in Mexico to build more pipelines to bring natural gas to the country in a stronger way, moving from oil, coal to natural gas as a very positive way to do the transition and to provide energy to the south of Mexico, which needs it so much. So it's not entirely negative. In fact, I think it could be much better. I think we should have stayed the course where we were before, but still what's going on the ground is very, very encouraging. And finally, supply chains. Listen, I think that after everything I have said, you can see it. It's obvious. If you go back to NAFTA 25 years ago, the transformation of the manufacturing base of the three countries was extraordinary. And this, by the way, in the case of the US too, despite the asymmetry, despite that this is the mammoth compared to two much smaller countries. In terms of manufacturing value chains or supply chains, the North Americanization of manufacturing is just spectacular. It's very difficult to say today, to speak of American products, Canadian products, or Mexican products. Increasingly, we are talking about North American products. And the beauty of NAFTA and now the USMCA is that in a very rational way, if you like, companies and investors are really allocating resources where it makes more sense for this North American manufacturing. Some things go to Mexico, some things stay in the US, other things go to Canada, but with the same logic. Let's produce more competitively. And of course, doing that has an enormous effect also on the people, consumers. And this is just not about the idea to talk just about economics, numbers, earnings. It's not that. I see it that, but I see different. I see it more differently, which is, or I make more emphasis in the question, on the issue of well-being, prosperity, equality reduction, human rights, the ability to enjoy health, the ability to enjoy housing, the ability to have a proper, well-paid job. Well, for that, we need these value chains to be super well oiled, modernized, and efficient. I finish by saying what's going on now, which is very encouraging. I am not a fan of the current US-China dynamics. Just to say that I think they are not going the way they should. I think it's very dangerous, and I think there are some trends that are really, really not positive. Okay. One of the side products of that, which is not only because of China or US competition or confrontation, however you want to see it, but also because of oil prices, energy prices, transportation prices, also because of economic logic. There is indeed a reshoring, nearshoring phenomenon. Again, it's not only because of China, US, it's not only because there is a political, what's happening, it's not because there is governments pushing for this famous decoupling that I don't think it'll happen ever, and I think it's a bad idea. It's also because the force of nature, the force of economics, because things sometimes make more sense one way or the other. And in this case, it's happening, and the amount of investment that is coming to US, Mexico, and Canada is phenomenal. And in the case of Mexico, I find it even more phenomenal, not only because it's incredibly big, but because it's happening despite policies that are put in place in Mexico that are, as you know, very controversial. You have American, European companies that are investing in Mexico to keep serving the North American market. But more fascinating, or more interestingly, Chinese companies themselves that have been serving the North American market, and because of the politics that we are seeing, but at the same time, the economics of production, they are setting shop in Mexico. So now I'm fascinated by that. There are full industrial parks being developed, particularly in the north of Mexico, with Chinese companies coming to opening factories to serve the North American market. So what we need to do in all these three areas, health, energy, and supply chains, is really to sit the three countries need to sit together more, work on regulations, harmonizing regulation, harmonizing policies, making better sense of the opportunity, understanding that one of the three is a giant, that Canada is way, way smaller, but very rich, very wealthy, but it's a 36, 37 million country. And Mexico is a very large country of 130 million people with enormous challenges. That is the weakest link in the sense that our economy is complex, is a bit smaller than, well, let's go, it's more complex, but it's a big economy, huge problem of inequality, poverty in some parts of the country, violence, drug trafficking, the fentanyl, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to find solutions. But despite that, or even because of that, we need to harmonize more, to work more, and to make sure that we really can imagine strategically, because it's in the best interest of the three, a much more effective North America as a region.
Okay, well, thank you so much. My goodness. So that was a recap of the themes that were explored in the fall lecture. It was explanation of the three themes that you have chosen to focus on: health, of affordable and reliable energy, and also of secure and efficient supply chains. and you've really explored the integration of North America within the global context. But this is a conversation, and I've been able to ask the first couple of questions, and so I really would like to invite our audience to join us with their own questions related to the points that have been raised. So I will.
So thank you, Ambassador. And I don't want to preempt the students.
I'm honored,
because
Jim.
I want them to have a chance too, but since I do have to go, I want to get a chance to get one question. And thank you for that brilliant exposition. So I want to focus on your third point here, and especially the point about China and the supply chain issue. We're going to find out. Happily, SAIS is hosting Janet Yellen tomorrow, who's going to lay out the U.S. economic strategy towards China. So we're going to know a lot more tomorrow about this. But my question to you is that you mentioned the opportunity and why China has an interest in investing in Mexico to access the U.S. market, right? But there's this danger right now that Mexico is going to get caught in the crossfire about this disaggregation of supply chains. The idea that friend shoring of supply chains, and that in order to continue to have access to the U.S. market, Mexico will have to be willing to join the U.S. in reducing its engagement with China, certainly at least in the very high-tech sectors, according to the kinds of regulations that Commerce put out last October, but even more broadly. I guess my question to you is how much concern is there in Mexico about the idea of having to choose in this, and what would be the implications for U.S.-Mexico relations and North American integration if the U.S. were sharper about that choice and basically continuing to make access, like under the Inflation Reduction Act, which Mexico benefited from, and more broadly under the USMCA, on essentially joining the U.S. in the friend-shoring enterprise?
Thanks so much, Jim. I'm really honored that you're here. Thanks. Mexico-China relation is very interesting for the following. On the one hand, historically, there had been enormous affinity between the two countries. Developing countries, the South causes, the developing countries causes, and of course, a bit anti-quote-unquote imperialistic thinking of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And Mexico and China worked on that front very closely together, always and still today. There is something in the skin that makes us understand each other seriously. I can even say, for example, that in the 70s, the Chinese Communist Party sent young officials to the party, to El Colegio de México, to study Spanish in Mexico and to study the PRI, which was fantastic by then because until 2000 was the longest serving single party in the world. So there is this affinity. But economically, since the late 80s, China and Mexico started to become increasingly big competitors because we both were competing for the US market. This is even before NAFTA. And you might remember, Jim, that even when the debate about accepting China to WTO and recognize it as a free market economy, and therefore all the benefits that should or would come from that, Mexico was the last country, literally the last, to accept that. And in fact, the confrontation between Mexico and China, because of that, was very strong. Why? Because we knew that as soon as China joined WTO, we would lose massive investment because many companies would choose China to manufacture because it was cheaper, and then to in order to serve the North American market. And in fact, that's what happened. We lost massive investment. There was a trend where many companies left Mexico and went to China, and others changed plans and instead of investing in Mexico, they decided to invest in China. And since then, we have been competing like that. And that hasn't changed. And in fact, today is very interesting because President López Obrador, despite his views that are well known, there's something on which he is very clear. No, let's say, less China and more North America. Let's reduce dependence on China, let's invest in North America, and let's become much more self-sufficient as a region. So economically, the competition has been has existed or has been happening for 3 decades and is very harsh. The challenge that China has in Mexico, which I think is going to be very interesting, and for us is going to be very interesting too, is that the logic of going to Mexico has been different degrees. Mexico is cheaper labor, and of course, very close to the US market. But the companies that are coming to Mexico are not, the Chinese companies that are coming to Mexico are not companies that are used to trade unions, to in general labor rights, minimum salaries, strikes, etc., etc. And the Chinese companies, I was reading a report of Chinese factories already in Mexico that were having a lot of troubles with their masters or headquarters in China because they didn't understand why they now had to pay transport for workers, why they needed to ensure X number of days of holidays. So the question of labor rights, all the social aspect, I think is going to be a huge challenge for the Chinese and the Chinese companies, and they will have to factor this in the new logic of being in North America. I still think it makes a lot of sense, and that's why they are coming. And number 3, which is more tricky, Jim, is on more strategic investments or sectors like telecom, 5G, that sort of technology that China is very interested in deploying in Mexico. I'm not a witness of that, and I don't have real information, but I'm guessing is being challenging for Mexico, and I think Mexico will have to make very hard choices there. And I think they are happening. I couldn't explain more, but I see this is happening. But the choice for Mexico is very clear. And let me conclude with one comment, which is very general. Mexico lived, in terms of foreign policy, we lived incredibly comfortably. It made a lot of strategic sense not to take positions. We always refused to take sides in the international agenda because we are many things, and we found a sort of niche that served us immensely well, which was being always the one in between, the bridge between developed and developing, because we have both, between North and South, because we understand both. So if you see Mexico in the UN, international organizations, in the G20 and all this, Mexico always was playing this role. But the more Mexico has been growing, evolving, the more democratic Mexico has become, the more quote unquote liberal democratic Western values we have accepted, acquired, the more human rights, the more Mexico is being forced to take sides. And I think that's where we are now, where also in this front, Mexico slowly will be pushed to take a larger stance in this terrible competition between China and the US.
Who would like to follow up with a question?
Thank you so much. Ambassador, thank you. Thank you so much. Don't want to turn this into a session on China by any means, but following the Dean's take, this is a really very, very hot potato currently. So I want to push a bit further on getting you to react to the statement the US should be concerned if Chinese economic engagement takes off in Mexico, similar to the way it's taken off in Brazil or Chile or Peru, the majority of the large economies of South America. My own perspective as Mexicano, as Mexican, is that in spite the onus being on Mexican decision makers regarding how they want to balance that approach, I think it's in our country's interest to do it. For the reason of next year, 30 years of NAFTA, you and I have spoken about this quite a bit, and we agree that this transformed our country. It created a strong manufacturing, I said middle power, and Ambassador said not middle, power. Yes, a strong manufacturing power when we could have potentially have ended up being a petrostate in the middle late 80s, not unlike Ecuador and Venezuela. So this is incredibly consequential. But year in, year out, between 3/4 and 4/5 of our exports come here to the US. This is something that all governments, 3 flavors, center, left, and right, have tried to address. You need to diversify your export market. You need to attract other than mainly American and then a bit European capital. I think, and I'm not a diplomat like you, and so therefore I might be missing a lot of things and end up behaving like a bull in the china shop. But I think that it's in Mexico's interests to attract Chinese economic engagement, continue to attract economic engagement, not as a counterbalance to the US, as a counterbalance of our incredibly concentrated export basket. We cannot be so dependent on the US. It's not fair for Mexicans that whenever the US catches cold, we catch pneumonia. China, this is the Asian century. Mexico needs to be bolder on the Western Pacific. That's my contention. Let's see what you think.
No, geography is destiny. We are where we are. Ask Canada how much of their many years' effort to diversify and to reduce their economic or manufacturing exports, imports, trade dependence, or any way you want to call it, with the US, how much have they achieved? 0. So yes, I think it's always healthy to increase the mix. And of course, we need to expand and diversify our trade, our economic ties, no doubt. Some governments have been more successful than others or more aggressive than others in pushing that. But Francisco, the force of gravity is unavoidable. The force of gravity is just brutal. The US, I go back to my first point, the sheer size of the US is just brutal. And in fact, the attractive, do you say attractiveness? Or the attractiveness of Mexico and Canada for foreign direct investment from other regions. Yeah, in the case of Mexico, it's its market, which is an interesting one, 130 million people, sure. Canada is very, very small. Really, what makes us very attractive is that we happen to be where we are, which is next to the US. So that. Now, in the case of the rest of Latin America, the situation is completely different because to begin with, almost non-Latin American country is a true manufacturing country. Latin America has been growing, has grown basically based on commodities exports. And the big buyer of commodities was China. And it's true that China is the biggest or has bigger economic ties with Latin America than the US itself. And I think, by the way, the US has been making a mistake in Latin America. But in the case of Mexico, Mexico is completely different economically to the rest of Latin America, completely different. We are next to the US. We are indeed a manufacturing powerhouse. I don't have on that, I don't have updated figures, but not so long ago, until before the pandemic, more or less 70% of the Latin American manufacturers were Mexican. 70% of the whole countries, Mexico, 70%. So we are a high value added manufacturing country thanks to NAFTA, thanks to NAFTA, thanks to the USMCA, thanks to being next to the US, thanks to the North American value chains. If there is a country that has been a beneficiary of this, is Mexico. So yes, we can try to diversify, absolutely. We should do more, absolutely, but it will always be microscopic relative to the weight and the space that the US plays in this equation. NAFTA is too powerful. Now, so much we believed in this that we are a country with one of the countries with the biggest number of free trade agreements in the world. The first free trade agreement of Japan was with Mexico. So we believe in it, but again, we are very attractive mostly because we are next to the US. This said, as I was mentioning to Dean Steinberg, of course we welcome the Chinese investment, as I was saying. It's coming, it's really pouring in. Industrial parks are being filled with Chinese factories, particularly in Nuevo León. It's just incredible. That is one thing, and the other is that we would favor, simply in this new logic, we can't, that companies stay in China and we keep importing from China. Mexico also imports from China to supply our own supply chains or value chains. So the more independent Mexico becomes to that, the more independent North America becomes from that. Aside politics and geopolitics, I think it's going to be important for Mexico.
Would you identify yourself for everyone?
Yes. Nina Gardner, and I teach business and human rights here at SAIS. So I have a quick comment on the surprise that the Chinese are having with the trade unions we've discussed, the surprise that Elon Musk will be having with the trade unions also in Mexico, and I look forward to reading about that. But I wanted to ask you a question about two flashpoints that you haven't mentioned that really keep me up at night, which is, of course, the whole immigration issue, of course, and the pressures on our border, and water. Those are flashpoints that really could create some serious tensions and have created, at least in terms of immigration. Water, not yet, but will be, I would say, 20 years down the line. How are our two countries going to resolve that? Because I don't think those are easily resolvable questions. Thank you.
They are not, sadly. Immigration first. I always say and discuss with my class, some of my students are here last semester and this, and in my previous life, that the worst thing on this debate on immigration is the mantra in the US, secure the border. No? The logic of everything comes down to secure the border. And it's not that I disagree with or the concept. I do, but it's more complex than just me disagreeing with secure the border, and I don't like it. I feel offended, as a good Mexican should feel. It's more complex. 2 or 3 things I would say quickly on this. Number one, the flow of migrants to the US comes for different reasons. One, yes, the US has been a generous country historically and has received those that are fleeing from harm, persecution, seeking refugee or asylum status. Perfect. Others, because of, again, we go back to the sheer economic size of the US, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens is that with one hand, due to the complex politics, division, polarization, and ideology in the US, with one hand, the US is saying no to all these people, migrants, from coming, no, and secure the border and all that. But less publicly, with the other hand, is calling them. Is calling them because the US doesn't have the labor that is necessary to keep running this massive economy. Just imagine now the infrastructure plan. Who's going to build it? Just for example, no? So there is a huge demand of, so this is one problem, 1 point. So the second problem of this is that, let's go back to the idea of secure the border, is that there's this notion that you can seal the border and just let on the Mexican side, I don't know, like migrants piling up, but they will stay on the other side, but it doesn't make any sense. They will keep coming. But second point I wanted to make on this. Mexico has been for many years the largest migration corridor in the world because of the sheer attraction force that the US causes. Good, bad, for whatever reason, the ones we were saying and more. But so Mexico is the largest migration corridor in the world. Since the last 10 years, migration coming through the southern border hasn't been Mexican. Mostly not. Now, after the pandemic, is picking up again. But basically, it was net zero, the Mexican migration. So the number of Mexicans coming, very small, and the number of Mexicans returning to Mexico, very big. No, Mexico is the largest corridor because we have massive numbers coming from Central America, number 1, Latin America, number 2, and then the rest of the world, number 3. There are more or less an average of 90 different nationalities entering the southern border of Mexico or plane trying to get to the US. Not many people know, and when they know, they are surprised, that we have had in Tijuana camps for Congolese, Ukrainians, Russians, Indians, Bangladesh, 90 nationalities. And let's remember Europe during the Atlantic, different Mediterranean migration crises. Governments were falling for 200,000 a year, migrants, no, in the whole Central Europe. Mexico is receiving more or less 200,000 a month. So where the US is right, ideology aside, is that the numbers are not manageable. To talk about 1 million migrants and refugees in the U.S.-Mexico border in less than in 10 months is just brutal. But where the U.S. is wrong is to think that the problem can stay on the Mexican side. That's absolutely wrong, and I will explain why. So what we need to do to address it, and is not solvable yet because the U.S. politics are not there yet, and haven't been there yet, by the way, in many decades, is number one, the U.S. needs to reorganize its immigration system. Who's coming, why, open up, regularize those that are here, et cetera, et cetera. It's a massive plan. The closest we were to that was just right before September 11. Between Bush, son, and President Fox, there was already a deal between the two countries to make a massive structural immigration reform in the U.S., and then September 11 came, and of course, it went down. So it hasn't happened, but it has to, but that's the solution. Number two, we need to work also with the rest of Latin American countries to make sure that each country does its job. Because Latin American countries, many of them, when the flows of migration are coming, they just open one door and just keep going, and I open the other one, so you keep going and live in the other border. And there, we need much more involvement of these countries to make sure that they all take migrants, take refugees. We make it in an intelligent way, and we reduce the flows to Mexico. Number three, we need massive investments in Central America. You and I sometime at some point discussed this, a sort of Marshall Plan, at least in the Northern Triangle, to transform El Salvador, to transform Guatemala, to transform Honduras, and to make sure that people do not need to leave, are not forced to leave. Why this matters for the U.S., in addition to allowing or not allowing people in the U.S.'s territory? Because these migration flows are eroding Mexico. When we are talking about hundreds of thousands of migrants in Mexico, are happening few things. Number one, Mexican institutions can't cope. Number two, organized crime is having a field day because they suddenly open a new business branch, which is smuggling, taking migrants, kidnapping migrants, and forcing them to work for organized crime. And all this is causing a huge damage to Mexico. For us, it's brutal and existential. For the U.S. also. The worst thing that it can happen to the U.S. if I were the U.S. and American making a choice or policy with political responsibility, the worst thing I would imagine for the U.S.'s security is to have Mexico becoming more complicated. So it needs a structural decision. Finally, water quickly. No, we do have already conflicts on water. As you know, we share the water in the Rio Colorado and in the Rio Grande. We distribute water on both sides. The water is increasingly scarce. We have a very well-organized institutional system, which is the International Commission on Limits on Water. So we share the water. It is very sophisticated, by the way, what we have there since 1947, the Treaty of Waters between the two countries. But it is becoming scarce, climate change, droughts, the rivers are getting dry, and communities on both sides of the border are struggling very seriously with water. I agree with you. There is not yet a long-term solution. It's very complex. There are conflicts already, and I don't even want to think what we're going to do in 2-3 decades, because it's going to be very serious.
And if I may, and just to say, I'm mindful of the time. We've got only 15 minutes left. Who would like to ask the next question? And are there any students that would like to participate? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. It's Pierre from your course last semester. Hey. So back on the migration piece, and I guess trying to link it to health mostly. You talked about, there's going to be future pandemics and all, and you mentioned that there needs to be a comprehensive new immigration plan that needs to happen. But as we saw during the COVID pandemic, the first instinct for the United States and pretty much a lot of countries across the world was to shut their borders. If that were to happen again in the future, if there is a next pandemic, what should the reaction be from the United States, Mexico, and Canada to prevent any kind of, closed borders from occurring, and to, work together on a potential response to that pandemic instead of going at it alone? A much more, I think, a combined approach between the three would be a lot more effective than going at it unilaterally. So I just want to hear your talk on that. And
that's an excellent question. This reflection applies not only to North America, Mexico, US, Canada, globally, and let's say global health security discussions post-pandemic. The effort, the challenge is the same in terms of how can we make sure that countries in the face of a pandemic or any health threat react based on science and epidemiological criteria instead of just chaos, fear, and politics. The pieces to make sure are there. One is called globally international health regulations, and now there is a pandemics convention being negotiated. That logic, we have to bring it to North America, because, by the way, in these instruments and these more global debates I was mentioning, precisely one of the key issues is in ensuring a reaction that is coherent, that makes sense, is how you balance, which is what you asked, how you balance the health imperatives with the economic imperatives, not for the sake of the economy, but for the sake of the people themselves as well. And that's a very difficult balance to strike. When do you decide to close a border if that's the solution or not? It's very, very challenging, especially then the politics, etc., are pushing. There are very interesting ongoing conversations between the three countries that were initiated by Trudeau, President Biden, and President López Obrador themselves, because this is very critical, in creating a sort of health ecosystem, health security ecosystem, that should contain 2 or 3 characteristics. Number one is what you said. We just don't close borders like that. If there is going to be a decision of closing borders, probably, if at any time it makes sense, because it really doesn't make sense, we think trilaterally and not individually. And this is very important. So the idea is basically not to close borders. Number 2, not to close borders to trade, which is also central. Number 3, access to vaccines, access to therapeutics. By the way, the US just announced a $5 billion project to enhance vaccines development, which is very, very encouraging. Well, now the issue is to make sure that both Mexico and Canada are truly part of this ecosystem where vaccines, therapeutics, antibiotics, drugs, masks, everything are properly guaranteed in the 3 countries. When the pandemic happened, COVID-19, for example, Mexico and Canada had contracts with Pfizer, but before the pandemic. And then when the vaccine was produced, Pfizer couldn't sell them to Mexico and Canada because the US banned exports of vaccines. So of course they were in violation of commercial contracts with Mexico and Canada, but forget about that. It didn't make any sense to try to immunize the US without Mexico and Canada getting immunized themselves. Geographically, with the integration, with the movement of people, with migrants, tourists, and all that, businesses, it simply didn't make sense. And Pfizer had to expand its factory in Belgium so they could serve Mexico or send vaccines to Mexico and to Canada. Well, that can't happen again. And these are the things that are being discussed. We also are very advanced in an interesting process to homogenize regulatory procedures for drugs approval. So as to make sure that, for example, once what's the name? The health authorities, I forgot the acronym, I'm sorry, in the US approved, the FDA approves a drug, this is immediately valid in Mexico or Canada or vice versa, just to speed up, to make sure that we really have access to all these treatments, vaccines, and therapeutics. And part of the conversations, which I find absolutely essential, is how, from a stronger North American health perspective, we also make sure that we provide vaccines as a region to Latin America and to poorer countries that is needed.
We are almost final. Right. Well, in that, please join me again thanking our
Thank you.
speaker for sharing all of his expertise with us.
Thanks so much.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you to you all. Thank you.
Okay.